Hey, 42 here. Australia is home to some truly nightmarish creations. And no, I don't mean Neighbours, which has inexplicably been on British TV for over 30 years. I'm talking about wildlife. The kind you can only find in the lands down under. Snakes that can kill you in an instant, spiders the size of your head, and a variety of other creatures that would rip out your intestines and eat your face as soon as you look at it. With that in mind, you'd think that if the Australian government ever decided to declare all-out war on one of the creatures that roam their beautiful land, it would be on something venomous, carnivorous, or at the very least, mildly bad-tempered. But no. In perhaps the greatest version of man vs. beast ever recorded, the Aussies went after the emu. The ensuing struggle was so bloody, it is today known as the Great Emu War of 1932. And no, I'm not making that up. But you can see why the government would want to go to town on these fearsome creatures, can't you? Just look at them. The baleful dead eyes, the small but probably very deadly beak, the stubby legs that could quite happily kick your elderly grandmother to death. But actually, the reasons for wanting to commit mass emucide were a bit more complicated than that. After World War I, the government decided to give their discharged veterans some land in Western Australia, so they could live out their days as farmers, have a bit of peace and quiet, and try to forget all about the horrors of war. It sounded good on paper, but in reality, it didn't quite turn out to be the utopia the veterans had expected. The land was unfertile and the farming hard, backbreaking work. And then the Great Depression arrived in 1929 to make things even worse. Wheat prices fell precipitously. The government failed to follow through on promised subsidies for farmers. And then, in 1932, just to add insult to injury, the emus turned up. 20,000 of them. And what was worse, they were hungry for the sweet taste of man flesh. Well, okay, wheat. But still, they were hungry. You could even say they were peckish. Mind you, this wasn't the first time the emus had made themselves known to man. Far from it. Up until 1922, emus had been a protected species. But they were soon reclassified as vermin after it became clear they had no respect for social etiquette. Emus, you see, don't have a firm grasp on the concept of farming. Through the eyes of an emu, a farm is basically a very convenient kind of all-you-can-eat buffet. But farming in Western Australia is hard enough as it is. So, when a horde of weird-looking birds comes along to joyfully munch through the literal fruits of your labour, you aren't going to lie down and take it. So, in 1923, a bounty system was introduced, offering cash for every emu killed. It seemed like a good idea at the time, and it probably would have worked pretty well, if it hadn't been for the numbers. These ex-military farmers were all well trained with a rifle, of course, but even with all their human-killing expertise, they were unable to slow the wave of feathered enemies heading towards them across no man's land. They simply didn't have enough ammo. By the time 1932 rolled around, it had become abundantly clear that unless someone invented a bomb that specifically vaporized emus, the farmers were going to need more guns, specifically of the large, fully automatic variety. Soon enough, several of these ex-soldiers were knocking on Minister of Defence Sir George Pearce's door, asking for more firepower. Feather-penetrating rounds, beak-seeking missiles, and of course, a lot more emunition. Okay, so they didn't ask for any of those things. For reasons I can't explain, they appear to have had almost no interest whatsoever in puns. But they did ask for machine guns with which to battle their emu opponents. And amazingly, the government agreed, not only providing the weapons in the form of 2 Lewis guns, but also sending in the army to wield them. The transport of fresh soldiers was paid for by the Western Australian government, and the farmers provided food, accommodation, and paid for the ammunition. It was probably overkill, but as far as Pierce was concerned, the birds would provide good target practice for his men, and the feathers could be used to make hats for the light horsemen. After all, if you're killing thousands of birds with 2 machine guns, you might as well kill 2 birds with 1 stone whilst you're at it. The operation was led by Major GPW Meredith of the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery. And if the amount of syllables in a person's title are any indication of his emu murdering capabilities, then he was certainly the man for the job. In October of 1932, he took 2 soldiers from his battery, along with 2 Lewis guns and 10,000 rounds of ammo, and headed off to assist the farmers. During the first day, however, the war was called off by rain, which admittedly makes it sound more like a tennis match at Wimbledon than a serious military campaign. You couldn't imagine Hitler saying, "Hold on lads, our panzers are getting damp. Let's invade Poland tomorrow." Anyway, this unexpected downpour made the enemy scatter, which was a significant problem. Because when you're trying to fire a barrage of machine gun bullets into a crowd of emus, you really don't want them to start valuing their personal space. But by the 2nd of November, hostilities had resumed once more. It was at this point Meredith and his men attempted to herd about 50 emus into a small area to make sure they were in range of the guns. But the emus appeared to cotton on to this plan and responded by employing their own version of guerrilla tactics, scattering into smaller units so they were difficult to target en masse. Even so, a stubby little beak versus a machine gun isn't exactly a fair fight, and sadly quite a few valiant birds lost their lives that day. But it took so many bullets to do the job that questions began to be asked as to whether the whole machine gun the emus thing was economically viable. Maybe financial warfare was part of the emu's battle plan all along, although they've never been known for their accountancy skills. Either way, Meredith had obviously vastly underestimated the enemy. Not only were they becoming increasingly difficult to hit, but when his men did manage to shoot one, most of the birds seemed to just take it in their stride. So much so that it was taking an average of 10 bullets to bring down a single emu. Although admittedly most of those shots missed their mark in the first place. Major Meredith later said, "If we had a military with the bullet carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks." And if that's true, why were they still using tanks in World War II? Shouldn't the Allies have ditched their armoured vehicles and ridden into Berlin on emus instead? The war of man versus feathery beast continued, but frankly by this point it was a comedy of errors. The next thing Meredith did was to set up an ambush near a local dam, and on the 4th of November, over 1,000 emus were spotted heading towards it. Everything was going swimmingly. All they had to do was wait until those beaky bastards were close enough and open fire. But as the birds finally got within range, the Lewis guns jammed, and only 12 emus were killed, whilst the rest legged it. Yet another day in the Great Emu War of 1932 was over without too much to write home about. Meredith was clearly struggling to match wits with his emu equivalent. And as crazy as it may sound, it really did seem like the enemy were operating under orders. In fact, several days into the war, observers noted that each pack of emus appeared to have its own general. A big guy about 6 foot high with black feathers who called the shots and kept watch, whilst the other emus helped themselves to crops. And is it just me, or do you imagine him wearing a battle-scarred helmet on his tiny head, a cigar clamped tightly in his beak, and saying things like, "I love the smell of napalm in the morning"?
10 hot!
No, just me then. Out of frustration, or maybe pure desperation, the army mounted one of the Lewis guns on a truck and tried to mow down the emus that way. The emus, however, were like Usain Bolt on speed. Not only that, but the ride was so bumpy, the gunner in the back was unable to fire off any shots. At one point, a particularly brave kamikaze emu managed to get his corpse caught in the truck's steering equipment, causing the driver to steer into somebody's fence, which promptly disintegrated. And in Western Australia, Fences were pretty damn important, which was another reason emus had to be sacrificed on the altar of agriculture. You see, emus not only destroyed the crops, they also left gaps in fences where rabbits could get through. So what, I hear you ask? What's the big deal about a few cute fluffy bunnies? Well, rabbits are a very big deal in Oz, hence the rabbit-proof fence, which runs for 1,700 kilometers across Western Australia. They're a significant factor in species loss and have a huge impact on both natural resources and crops, due to the fact they graze like a fat man at a wedding. Mind you, the rabbit fence hasn't done a fantastic job of bunny massacring, because they're still a problem. In the 1950s, the Myxoma virus, which causes myxomatosis, was deliberately introduced into the rabbit population in Australia. This cut down numbers for a while, but the rabbits have since developed immunity, allowing them to keep on breeding like rabbits. Could the Great Rabbit War be next? Only time will tell. By the 8th of November 1932, 2,500 shots had been fired in the Great Emu War, all of them by the human side, I should add, but the number of emus killed was only in the hundreds, with some claiming it was as low as 50. Still, it wasn't all doom and gloom, because Meredith made a note in his official report, sounding particularly proud of himself, that not one of his men had been injured during the battle, which is a miracle when you think about it. I mean, those poor men were left to face a mass of placid flightless birds all on their own, with nothing but machine guns to defend themselves. It's a miracle any of those boys got out alive. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it was also around this point Meredith started losing the support of the local media. They were making quite a big deal of the fact that only a few emus were dying, especially given the Rambo-esque levels of firepower being brought to bear. It also didn't help that serious questions were being asked in Parliament. For example, when one politician suggested medals should be awarded to those brave soldiers taking part in the Emu War, a member of the opposition said the medals should be given to the emus instead, as they'd won every round so far. If the agricultural ramifications hadn't been so serious, Meredith and his men could easily have become a laughingstock. Defence Minister George Pearce, who'd agreed to the whole thing in the first place, was even given the unofficial title Minister for the Emu War, which could hardly have been a feather in the cap of his military career. Still, he kept on defending the operation, and with support from the Premier of Western Australia, it was agreed battle would recommence. On the 13th of November, bullets were flying once again, and by the 2nd of December, the military were killing around 100 emus per week. That was definitely an improvement, but it was hardly putting a dent in the mass ranks of emus, and by 1934, the higher-ups in government were clearly at the end of their tether. I'll stop now, I promise. The bounty system was reintroduced, and the farmers were given enough ammunition to take care of the issue themselves, which proved to be pretty effective because over 57,000 bounties were claimed in the following 6 months. Mind you, there must still have been a fair few emus knocking around, because in 1943, wheat farmers were concerned enough to request military assistance with the growing emu threat once again. And apparently having learnt from the debacle with the Lewis guns, this time the farmers had a better idea. They wanted the army to bring bombs. Lots of bombs. I'm happy to say the military respectfully declined the invitation. But the emu problem wasn't going away, and in 1950, it was raised in federal parliament, where Army Minister Josiah Francis approved the release of 500,000 rounds of ammunition to help with the claiming of bounties. All told, around 300,000 emus were killed in Western Australia as part of the Great Emu War and the skirmishes that followed. But who really won the Great Emu War of 1932? Man or emu? It's true, a lot of emus were sent to meet their beaky maker, and so far as we know, not one human combatant died in the line of duty. But even so, the emus put up a remarkably good fight considering the circumstances. These days, the majestic emu appears on the Australian coat of arms, which is more than you can say for Major GPW Meredith. And in 2020, a video game was released based around the Emu War, but I've yet to see a game set in the Western Australian Parliament. Perhaps the greatest victory of all, however, is that the emu is still with us. And it's thankfully now illegal for anyone to murder them with machine guns, bombs, or anything else for that matter. So maybe that sarcastic politician was right. Maybe the emus should have been given a medal after all. And maybe we should have a day of remembrance for those emus who lost their lives defending their right to eat their own body weight in wheat. Maybe we can convince Christopher Nolan to make a movie about it, like he did with Dunkirk. I'm sure Tom Hardy would make a fantastic emu. Thanks for watching. You can now buy my new book, Stick a Flag on It, on Amazon, or get the audiobook on Audible. You'll find a link to both in the description below. Thank you.